Um, Thank you, Enrique. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. It's more or less exactly 4 years since I was last here in this room doing a talk. And I had a look on the way here. On my laptop, I have the talk I did 4 years ago. And I thought, 4 years, oh, that's a huge amount of time. I mean, many of you weren't here 4 years ago, weren't at university yet. And then when I went through it, I sort of thought, God, 4 years is a short time in an architect's life. I mean, we are so slow. You know, making work is a really, really slow and kind of immersive process. So some of the things I'm going to show this evening are, I actually showed 4 years ago, and then some of them are more recent, and some of them are absolutely current and half finished. So I hope it's kind of, it's sort of, I suppose evolution is one of the central themes of the talk. The first slide here is of my partner, Stephanie McDonald, who's sitting up there on that kind of a stage seating. And the reason I show it is it sort of combines two worlds. There's the world that I share with my partner in London with the office, which is now about 25 people. And then the structure itself was designed and made by my students in Zurich. And there it is on the roof of the Luma Foundation, which is part of the kind of the Kunsthalle Löwenbräu Center in Zurich in January. And I suppose it's the intersection, or the kind of the traveling through between those worlds, which I think is what I'd like to, where I'd like to somehow tease out some of the themes. So that structure was part of an exhibition called Making Stages, which was a kind of collaboration between art and architecture. So people like Dan Graham were in the show, quite a few architects, Peter Merkley, we were in there. And we were there kind of in a double collaboration. One, which is the collaboration with the students, which is the structure on the outside. And the other one is on the top left of that image, which is a small shelf. And it's a small piece that we did with the British artist called Richard Wentworth, who has been very important in our careers. We met him as students. He still remains a very good friend and mentor. And it's a piece that we recreated from 1998, and I will come back to it. But I guess it's sort of already setting up some of the themes, which is to do with looking up and looking down. We work in London a lot, and London has always been a city about trade and about travel. It's a port city. It once had an empire, not anymore. But if you look up, you will see the traces of that kind of worldliness, that kind of, that sort of travel. On the tops of buildings, shipping is often represented, along with compass points. And of course now, like in every city, shipping is now flying in the sky. It's about topography. It's about looking down. It's about the ground and how the ground ultimately shapes, determines, directs what we do, whether we like it or not. And I suppose it's about bricolage as well, and about a certain way of making do and getting by, a certain way of working with what you're given and trying to make the best of an occasion. This is a photograph by Richard Wentworth of these sort of stools adjusted to a very particular kind of urban threshold. And so this idea of bricolage and reuse, I suppose, is central to it. And bricolage is loosely a term for tinkering, improvisation, DIY, and generally doesn't have a good reputation in architecture. It's seen as rather amateurish. But actually, I think that it is very closely connected to nature and to evolution, so it should be treated with probably more seriousness than we often do. This is a slide from a catalogue of an exhibition curated by Hans Hollein in 1976 called Man Transforms. And it's really about the kind of anthropology of making. And I suppose that a lot of this is to do with the relationship between making and the territory. So with bricolage, if the task is small, then really the means are to do with the material and skill. So tools and the material available. But when you're talking about work at a larger scale, we have to kind of find a new set, which is not just to do with material and skill. And perhaps this is what I'm calling the natural history or the survey. And the survey is a very central part of the work we do, the recording of what we find. And these are 4 pictures from a book which I think is completely fascinating me at the moment. I've only discovered it relatively recently. It's called London's Natural History. It was published in the late 40s by a guy called David Fitter, young man who, after the Second World War, decided to do a complete survey of London's natural history, of its plant life, of its mineral life, of its animal life. But unlike most natural historians of his day, everything he surveyed was human habitat. So you get these kind of extraordinary images on the top left of Richmond Park. The deer are still there today. I'm not sure if they're quite as bold now as they were in the 40s. St James's Park, this is right in the centre of London, bottom left. Man in bowler hat feeds pelicans. And then the ones on the right, I mean, again, and all the way through the book, natural history is never presented as separate from culture. It is culture. We are natural. And I think that that's a really extraordinary theme. This is from the same book. Then he takes these sort of surveys of things like, you could say, the geological basin that is his area of study. So he goes from the particular to the territorial. And that connects very closely to the work that we've been doing at ETH, which I'll show in a moment, and of the surveys of, you could say, the disappearing cities of post-industrial Europe. And this is only about an hour and a half away in Forst, near Cottbus. And the picture on the left is in the late 30s, and exactly the same view by one of my students on the right in 2011. And somehow it became like this rallying call for a certain condition that we find ourselves in Europe, in a kind of post-industrial one, where growth, or at least industrial growth, economic growth, is not an infinite slope. It's also about imitation, and very closely associated with bricolage is the idea of learning through imitation. And of course, it's the oldest story in architecture, the idea that one type of construction in the end embodies the memory of another. And in classicism, probably most famously, it's the trig lifts at the top are like a memory of timber construction, of the beams coming through. The fluting of columns is a memory of gathering reeds, etc. You probably, I'm sure you know the story. But it's not just representational, it's also in the whole process of repair. And repair, I think, is one of the central duties that we have towards our environment today. And here you have a Japanese temple where the column, the base of the column that has rotted, has been replaced with a piece of stone, so it won't rot again. But that piece of stone is behaving like a piece of timber. So it's a timber joint made in stone. And those, I would say that is part of the evolution of architecture. Of course, this process of imitation needs to be checked every now and then, because sometimes we get a little confused, especially in London, which is quite a mess. But brickiness is a very, is at the center, I think, of the London soul. Also, you have the kind of confusion of habitat, again, from Fitter and this natural history. The idea of, the nest in the tree, I think it's by the Bank of England, which is fortunate because it's by John Soane, and I'll come back to that later. And then the nest in the lamp. And then he goes on to show on one page cabbages, which are attacked by caterpillar. And then you turn over the page, this is plate 15, he has butterflies. He's obviously understood something very profound about the way the world works. All of that, of course, is always related to ground, and in London, it's always clay. On the top is a geological map from the book, and the Thames Basin is basically made of clay, hence London is made of brick. And on the bottom is basically the beginning of a construction site, and in some respects I would say that's where architecture begins, is when we start scratching the ground. And from that ground, if you cook it hot enough, you make bricks. And I'm going to start, I suppose, with this image of a typical London street. This is in the centre of London, the Georgian street of row houses, terraced houses. And this is a view from my office window. My office is here, in this building, but it actually started there, in the backs. So I suppose that there's going to be a kind of oscillation between fronts and backs. What goes on the street, which is there, what goes on in the back. There we go, a little close up, and we're going to go straight down into it. This is about 5 years ago, this image. It's lunch at our office on one of the few nice days. And I was having a look at it on the plane in the morning, coming over, and actually 4 of the people in this image are German, 3 of them are Swiss, 1's Italian, and only 3 are British. And that's been sort of the story of our office ever since it started. I suppose it's a story of London. We're kind of all foreigners. But if you stay in one spot, you can also get some of its natural history. This is the same courtyard with building work started after we moved out, and it became my house with Stephanie and our family. And the moment you scratch the ground, you find a kind of a complete anatomy of the city, of its stories through time. So some of this is ancient, some of this is new, but it's in here you can see almost like the material palette that forms the city. So you have below ground, you have more clay, some sand, some bricks, cast iron, of course, which is absolutely the sort of, you could say, the industrial trigger of London. And we'll see some more of that as we go through the city. We see it in the ground. We see it on the surface of the ground. It becomes the decorative very quickly. But as soon as it becomes decorative, it comes back to nature. It goes back to a representation of nature, to Fitter's thing. And when we look up, it becomes, you could say, more organic. It becomes a bit more systematic, but it also very responsive. And in many respects, this roof, which was our studio roof when we started out, you could say is more American than is British. It's a bit of sort of imported America, which then became the basis of the first project, which I'd like to show. Because it's quick, because it's cheap, because it's versatile. It's all the things that are kind of great about American construction. And this is a small house in the back gardens in East London for a woman called Lizzie Tripp, who has MS, multiple sclerosis. And she asked us to do a house where she could go from the street to the garden, which is her passion, as with most English people, in her wheelchair, and a level difference of about 1.5 meters. She also said, whatever you do, don't touch my sumac tree, which is this tree here. So these almost technical, emotional challenges became the way in which we made a project which was as lightly as possible to bend round the tree in the back gardens of East London and to somehow take out the slope. The whole house is on the ramp. And it then stretches through right into the back garden. This is her back garden. This is a very typical scene of this kind of backs condition. And then in the end forms a kind of new place around the tree, a new house which then she joins her family again, becomes at the center of her family, like her tree is at the center of her garden. So a small project in which the kind of the constraints of these backs, the versatility of a kind of slightly a very basic construction, then forms a kind of a landscape, an inhabited landscape. It was made out of reclaimed timber, not for any ecological or ideological reasons, for reasons of cost. On the left is railway sleepers, which are made of jarrah, which is an Australian hardwood they use to make the railways, and cut into slices because it doesn't need treating. It starts off really red, slightly pinky red, now it's grey. And the idea behind that actually had come slightly in reverse. It had come from a project we did, a little building we did in Zurich. And this is one built by my students in 2010 called 96 Hands. And I suppose it brings in the theme of collaboration. We used to start every semester with a building project. So most of the theme of our studio is about landscape. But we start with a building that they have to make with zero budget, more or less zero budget, in 2 weeks together. So they have a 2-week period to design and build this using only hammers and nails, the most basic and kind of almost open and democratic building technique. They do a competition that they vote on, they choose a winner, and then they make it. And then in this hall, we had a lecture, in fact, there was a series of symposia, of seminars, lectures, parties, and it became a little kind of hall or temple for and this was one of the kind of details that they invented. They had to work out all the structure. And in order to have enough nails to get the shear force, I think it needed 21 nails, they calculated. They found in an old book, old construction manual, an example where you put all the nails in the circle so that you don't align them in the grid. So it stops the wood from splitting. So the construction becomes the decoration, and that was sort of, I think, one of the little micro discoveries that made this project go. And then the next semester they took it down, the next group of students took it down, and then they rebuilt another building with it, or a copy of this building by Villanova Artigas in the São Paulo province called João. It's a bus station, mainly because of the geometry, the incredible geometry of the concrete. And we thought, I wonder if we could do that in timber. Of course, it would have been made in timber in order to make it in concrete. So it must be possible. And they started this process of kind of design competition and reusing the first building in order to make the second. Is then taking it down, digging foundations, we're back to ground again. Ground is so complex, and I think is one of the sort of architectural spaces least understood by our subject. This is them bringing it out and then constructing this kind of summer pavilion. It was basically the smallest fragment we could get stable, so 3 of the legs, all again nailed together, and a kind of summer meeting place on the edges of the ETH campus. At that point, it looked almost like a kind of Wright brothers early airplane. And this theme of, I suppose, kind of working in the landscape, working with cheap construction, goes back to another project that we did in London, which is this time in Southeast London. So East London, Southeast London are very much the working class areas of London, and it's in the backs. It's kind of in this area. The South London Gallery is a late 19th century building behind an art school. And it was very badly bombed during the war. This housing estate sort of replaces all of that. And then only in South London could you get places which still remain derelict 50 years afterwards. You know, you get a sense of its economy. But this is the original gallery with one of the installations. It's a very, very good contemporary art gallery. This is the art school built in 1903 in front of it. And so our project was really about what to do with this little derelict house, this very modest house beside it. This was it at the beginning as a kind of shell. And the interiors, again, in some respects, quite un-English. Reminded me a lot of kind of Frank Gehry's house, who I think is probably one of the great kind of poets of cheap timber construction, especially in his early work. And so our project was really sort of to turn these backs into fronts, to make out of this world a public building. It's almost kind of fitter-like. So the circle is where the gallery is. The history of it is not, in many respects, that important, only in as much as the city built around, it's a 19th century part of the city, it's industrial. It has these typical workers' houses. You'll find them all over South London and the sort of periphery of North London. And then our job was to kind of refurbish this house to make an apartment for an artist in residence, some gallery spaces here, a cafe here, and then a kind of art space, social space in the garden at the back there. And so the project, this is a little bit pixelated, but it doesn't matter too much, was the house is there, a new building on the back of it, and then a new education building in the back garden along the back wall. But then this project became really about collaboration. And as we were designing it, we also helped with the installation, this installation, just a bit of technical help by the American artist Chris Burden, which is these kind of cast iron lamps, 19th century lamps from LA that make a kind of a room set. And alongside that, we also helped to try and install this thing, which is another of his installations, which is this flying steamroller. It's an installation where he drives this steamroller around in a circle, and at a certain point, tilts the balance, and it basically takes off and floats under its own weight for 15 minutes. It's kind of the most extraordinarily beautiful thing. And it was meant to be at the back of the gallery. And this is the circumference of the steamroller as installed there. So it just about fit in the site, except that if you came out from the gallery here at the wrong moment, so anyway, it's beside Tate Britain. But what this drawing did do, which was provoked by Chris Burden, was to suddenly kind of charge this backspace with more kind of centrality than we'd never given it. And then we found from an archive that there were actually two buildings. This is the existing gallery, and there was another one there. So between the archive and the installation, we decided that we would move the building, and in fact, we found this amazing map where you can see where it says ruin, ruin, ruin. That's a sort of post-war map of the kind of the landscape of London in the late 40s and 50s. And of course, beside the ruin, the building was lost. So it's really about these backs, it's about that kind of natural history, and about sort of remaking a building that's very faint over here that then kind of rhymes with the house, but also with the grander building, and then makes a new geography around the whole site. So you can effectively go around in a circuit now, from domestic to contemporary to garden to education to garden, back into gallery, etc. This is the building process. Building in the backs, you can only build with sticks. Everything is small, hence bricks being so useful in London. Outsides become inside. And then we did another installation with a Brazilian artist called Vani Neuschwander. We didn't do it with her, we helped her execute it, and called Suspension Point. And she sent a sketch of a floor being built across the whole gallery. And we did it as cheaply as we could, which is this sort of timber frame, like the tree house earlier on, like our studio. It's just the most common and easy way to build. And as we were doing it, as we were also making the drawings for this, we were also making the drawings for this, which is the new building. So somehow, whether it was Radvani's installation that influenced our building or our building that influenced her installation, in the end, it felt like we were never alone. We were always in sort of some other constructional space, some other tradition. This is the kind of the lifting of the building. This is really, building in England. London is a messy place to build in. South London is even messier, and the backs are about as crazy as it gets. Actually, this guy's a German carpenter who was leading the whole thing, who's horrified by British building practice. But anyway, so this is the kind of forming of the building. Everything has a lantern on top, like the original building up there, which is a terrace on the new building. And of course, it's not, we've got our friend Frank Geary there, who has always been, I think, certainly his early work, I think some of the most amazing contemporary buildings in the last couple of decades. This is the education studio at the back. It's a really tough bit of London, and it had to kind of fold down, close down like a safe deposit box. They buried some lights to light up the trees somewhere to the left of this image, and on the first night they were stolen, including the concrete socle. So you get a sense of what it can be like in Peckham. But then we were sort of interested in these sort of opening up worlds that you get particularly with somebody like John Soane. I don't know if any of you have been to see his house in London, where every room hides another room. And so basically that building sort of opens up and then becomes this sort of totally internalized, you kind of reveals this internalized world with a lantern once again, the same timber construction, so very, very cheap. This is an installation by David Shrigley, and of course it goes right back to our building. So there is no difference between that and that, apart from maybe a little bit tidier in 2010. And then it leads you through from one building into another building and into more collaborations. These were castings made by a Dutch artist during the project, which ended up being laid into the building. And so the whole project is a kind of amalgam of these different building techniques, different collaborations, different encounters. Some moments where it wasn't even a collaboration. This is the carpenter, an English carpenter called Mikey, who didn't like our detail, and so decided to do it his way, which was much more beautiful. And I never realized how much we look up when we go upstairs. So it's on the underside of the handrail, but it's always a nice little moment. And then the building finished a bit late, as it often happens. And so the first installation coincided with the first exhibition coincided with the end of the building. So we started seeing our drawings on site, but they weren't our drawings, they were the artist's drawings. And they were starting doing the first wall drawings. The building was left unfinished in many cases, and the painting straight onto the fabric of the walls. So it became this sort of total environment. This is that new space at the top, at the back, with a wall. Oops, sorry, I keep on pressing the wrong button here. This wall, which we put a huge amount of effort in, is 8 meters long, 7.5 meters high, and has no light switches on it, nothing. So it's the perfect art wall. The artist came along and decided to use the other one with the fire escape sign and the intruder alarm and the fire curtain, and that's one of the really interesting things about making work, is that the moment you finish, you have to hand it over, and it's not yours anymore. And then did this amazing wall drawing in gold leaf. In fact, it was a gold leaf artist from Berlin who installed it. And since it was meant to be temporary, but it's somehow become permanent, it's now part of that room. And of course, it's all about the garden below, it's all about the garden above, and all the rest of it. And so now you see this kind of world being sort of smashed into London backs, which maybe is a little bit like the kind of the sort of ad hoc world of Jacques Tati in Mon Oncle, if you know the film. So that's the sort of the kind of, I suppose, the fragmentation of this backland. And the garden. The garden, which is like in Fitter's world, always a human habitat. It's more than just planting. It's where you cultivate food, it's where humans coexist, and even when you take the natural history into the interior and you start looking at things like spiders, the cockroaches, we're still in an interior. I could still recognize that window as being a London window. And I probably more or less recognize that cobweb too. It didn't come from this room, but it could have come from this room, which is in Spitalfields, which is in central East London, and is one of a series of photographs from this other art gallery that we did in London called Raven Row. This is a photograph from 1903. This is it in the 1960s. That whole bit of town went bankrupt. And it brings me back to this installation with Richard Wentworth. So this is the catalogue from the first show, and the original installation were these two books. They're the same book, one in English, one in French, of Georges Perec's Life of User's Manual, which is probably one of the big influences on our work as well. And his kind of cataloguing, his narrating of the city, and this is him in the center, doing one of his sort of, you could say, almost like a dérive project to do with recording his memories of the city in text. But this book, which is about the life of an apartment building in Paris, was inspired by this illustration by Saul Steinberg, the American illustrator, which is the idea of all the rooms of an apartment building being simultaneously visible and every life being interconnected with each other through history, through stories, through events, and through accidents. And that is actually the section through this building. So somehow these rooms, the two that I just showed you, felt like it kind of resonated with this kind of narrative approach. This is the building built in the mid-18th century, although actually it's late 17th century. That's the problem with history, it's never quite consistent. It's built outside the city wall. That's the City of London, the financial centre. That's the Thames. This is Spitalfields, which was colonised by French Huguenots, French Protestants, who were persecuted in the early 18th century from France and left and went to Scandinavia and went to Britain. And they made a new town where they could trade outside the city walls. They were silk mercers, silk makers, and they made one of the most exquisite bits of London today. That little bit top left explains the sudden density of that bit of town. It's the railways. That changed everything for London, and suddenly it became absolutely full. Some of you may recognize this is Brick Lane, and then Liverpool Street is over here. So it's in this very, very tight little bit of town just outside the city. After the French had arrived, made their businesses, made a lot of money, gone bankrupt, they left and dispersed around London. And then the next wave of immigration comes in the 19th century, which is Central European and Russian, Jewish immigration. And you start seeing it, and it's still there now, Jews Free School, and there's still a very, very large Jewish community, but now that's been overlaid with Asian immigration. So this part of London, this part of East London, is always like the arrivals lounge. When we started the project, in an archive, I found these photographs, a box of 70 photographs dating from 1903 to 1972, all anonymous. We don't know why somebody went in. In fact, several people went in because it spanned 70 years. Why they took these photographs, and they're kind of incredibly good quality. It's like Eugène Ager or something like that was in town and recorded the kind of the story of the city through these interiors. Some of them amazing. I mean, the white furniture on the white side, the dark furniture on the dark side. They could almost be like Boltanski pieces. This is the England that I almost remember from the 70s, like how my grandmother lived. So you'd be forgiven for not knowing that this is one of the finest 18th century interiors in London, which is sort of what gives the photograph a kind of pathos. And this box became really the center of our study. So these are the original buildings, and our project was to make new galleries. This is the ground level that goes through, and to excavate them below this 70s office building, to push them under because there wasn't enough height. The plan is fairly simple. You've got two houses, one here, very typical Georgian terraced houses, or at the top end of the Georgian terrace houses, and then 2 new galleries, a courtyard gallery top lit and an alley gallery which is side lit below ground level. Above you have a very typical floor plan of English terrace houses, front room, back room. The back room is smaller to accommodate the stair. And then the second floor where the family would live. So the family would do business on the first floor. They would live on the second floor and sell from the ground floor. And then the third floor was rebuilt in the 70s, and the fourth floor was also rebuilt in the 70s. So it's where that white building is, below that white building. Basically a pretty crappy back alley in London. So we made a whole series of study models for this kind of change in level, and then the building process starts. And in this bit of London, it's kind of like dentistry. It's just sort of chipping away at things because it's so congested. You can just about get a kind of a small digger in there. And like in the South London Gallery, every project in England gets this plaster that's called bonding plaster, which is this sort of almost flesh-coloured, pinky, browny, flesh-coloured plaster. And it turns everything into a cave. It's like kind of mud. It's the most kind of extraordinary stuff. But of course, it gets painted white for a kind of white cube gallery. And that's it when it was finished. But I suppose that was simple enough. The bit that becomes interesting was not so much the making of the white cube gallery, but it's when the culture of the white cube gallery comes shooting through into the 18th century houses. And this is one of the photographs from that box of archive box, sorry. And I think it was the one that sort of mystified us the most. It's probably the most beautiful. It's the day after a fire, obviously a very violent fire, and all the architecture is still there. It's kind of like the resilience of architecture, even in that kind of violence, that kind of heat, it still keeps its body, it keeps its expression. That's it now, so the black goes to white, it's been restored, but that image somehow remained present with us. And it was my colleague Takeshi Hayatsu, who's Japanese, who showed then me this picture of the town where his parents come from. And he said, well, look, burning, fire and architecture are actually go together in Japan. It's a kind of form of cladding, it's a form of protection, because timber doesn't burn a second time. So it's a type of fire protection. So we decided that we would use that technique on the roof of the building. This is him burning things. That's that courtyard that I've showed already. Then he went back to Japan, because that doesn't work, it's not hot enough. You need to make a furnace. He went to Japan and found a guy who knew how to do it. And you make a chimney out of 3 timber pieces, and then with some straw on the inside, you light it at the bottom, and it burns within like a furnace. The flames start coming out of the edges when the surface burns deeply enough, and then it falls over. It burns all the tape and rope. It falls over. It takes about 3 minutes. It's very Japanese. It's really elegant. You know, I was there with a stopwatch, going, "How long do we burn it for?" And then Takesh was like, "No, it will tell you." And that was the contractor with the suit there, really not knowing what was going on. And I would say this is probably maybe the most modern of the pictures I have in this talk. This is a farm in the center of England with a traditional Japanese burning technique being carried out by Lithuanian builders. I think that is seriously modern. So this is it going onto the building. So it forms this kind of roofscape on the outside of the room that burnt, of the new building. And then you get this sort of tumbling over of the kind of temporality, the history of the building. This is the 18th century, but it's got a 1970s floor, concrete floor. This is England in the 70s. I mean, everything was broken. And so we started taking these kind of juxtapositions of materials in the wrong place and somehow trying to remap this building through the construction process. So using precast concrete to make a stone staircase. So these are precast slabs that come together to make what they call a cantilevered stair, which is a very typical 18th century staircase, where you just rest one tread onto the next with this little bird's mouth joint Tiny, tiny joint, but if it's really precisely done, it will just pass the loads from one step to the next, right the way down. And then to finish it, this is the original staircase, which has this fantastic swoosh at the bottom. We decided to make a smaller swoosh. You can't really do those in contemporary galleries. But something that would tell your fingertips that you've arrived. So these are some models from the office, stolen details, a casting. So we got really into casting on this project, kind of heat-intensive processes, and this sort of flattened, almost kind of golf club, just cast in sand, and then that runs right the way up through the building, up the stair, from the staircase into the doorknobs. And then the doorknobs, this was actually the client who pressed his hand into one of the molds and said it needs to be more special. So he got his fingerprint in it. And then the plaster, this was the only moment where we used serious modeling, digital modeling, is where 18th century flat arch meets 21st century white cube gallery. And we wanted to kind of morph them one into the other. And so we kind of lofted it and then got these guys to make it as a kind of plaster shell, almost like a photographer's infinity cove. And it almost dissolves the threshold between the two. So the transition somehow disappears. It just then kind of gets sucked from one condition into another. And that interest in plaster had come from this ceiling, which is in the first floor, which is a very rare carved ceiling, carved in plaster of Paris, which is in this room here. And this is a picture of that room, again from this archive box, from 1914, from June 1914. So it has a certain pathos, that image, in that it was about just a couple of months before Europe tore itself apart. But after the First World War, it was taken out of the building. After the First World War, Britain was absolutely broke, and America was very wealthy. America had very little history, and England had loads. So they started selling history, selling rooms from historic buildings for offices, for fancy houses, for museums all over the States. And this one we found what had been in Chicago, in the Chicago Art Institute. And we got it back, and this is the first crate arriving back in London with the room inside it. This kind of very early prefabrication, Rococo in bubble wrap. No instructions to this stuff. You just get crates and crates of pieces that then were restored and then put back in. And they'd come back. And of course, I mentioned at the beginning this idea of ground, that London is made of clay and it's always moving. So the building had moved by about 15 centimeters in the 80 years since the room was away. But anyway, we got it back in, and that's the room now. It's called Chicago. We never found the fireplace. But it's the only original 18th century room in the building, because it's the only one that wasn't there when it burnt down. So it's a sort of rather kind of curious, behavior of all these rooms somehow being wrong. And this is a little sort of journey through the building at the end. The first floor galleries, just door to door. This is an installation by a woman called Alice Shannon, a very interesting artist, who made castings of smoke rings. She had no idea that she put them in that room. I think somehow there are ley lines. There are some of these memories you can't get away from. And these rooms, these sort of domestic rooms, make amazing spaces for contemporary art, for like video art. There's a kind of intimacy to them. And then that was a couple of years ago. And then this is only about 2 weeks ago, where suddenly we're on the third floor here, and it's kind of full of earth. And somehow that felt like another kind of transition. But one of the most important shows that we've done there, that we designed, was for this guy who's called Seth Siegel, who's one of the pioneers of conceptual art. He's an American who very sadly died about 2 years ago, who really set up the first conceptual art show in New York in the late 60s with people like Joseph Kossuth, Lawrence Weiner, Carl Andre, and then gave up conceptual art in the 70s when he thought it had gotten too far with the market. And to cut a long story short, started collecting textiles, because he thought that textiles was the only thing that had the sum total of of human knowledge, of human culture in a kind of collectivized form. So the story of agriculture, of the law, of religion, of class, of taste, of economics, of trade, comes through textiles. Those are religious ones behind him. And then he only accepted to show his collection because these buildings had been built for silk makers in the first place. So somehow it was very important to him that the resonance of textiles was strong. So we did this show, and of course textiles refers always back to nature, to the animal kingdom, to plant life. And that runs through right away through the precious textiles and even these really cheap ones. I mean, look at this amazing interior. This is the 4th floor of the same building. While we were doing the work, there were 2 old ladies who lived there, 2 sisters called Hannah and Rebecca Levy, who were Jewish. One was in her late 80s, the other in her 90s. They'd lived in the house since the 1920s. And after the fire, this apartment had been built for them in 1972, and they lived there on their own, while the rest of the building was abandoned. And this is one of the archive photographs, none of which they remember. And it was only many years later that suddenly I looked at this archive photograph from the 60s, and this table, this piece of furniture, this vase, and you realize that it's still there. And somehow, again, the temporality, the human lives lived, the furniture placed actually outlives sometimes the architecture. And of course, these motifs of the garden and nature, even in the most synthetic parts. But the last bit of this project is this image, which is of the front of the building and of this part, where the cast iron railings were stolen in the 60s. So again, in order to reconstitute the story of the building, we decided to make the rear facade in cast iron, the kind of missing material of the building. This is it in Essex, just east of London, pouring the panels. I mean, it's ancient technology. It's poured into sand. It hasn't changed for a couple of thousand years, several thousand years. And then this is it. It's a casting of burnt timber. This is it arriving. Then it goes orange. Then it goes brown. Now it's more or less black, like that. And then that sort of frames you could say, the back alley, and the complete material narrative of the project. And it was then the starting point for the next project, which is also cast iron, but in a much posher bit of town. This is a facade for the designer, Paul Smith, who had seen the Raven Row and wanted a new facade in Mayfair, in Albemarle Street, which is, I suppose, the polar opposite economically. And somehow the idea that cast iron would be the background of London seemed to kind of fit his idea, especially if it could then have a kind of decorative element, which is something somewhere between textiles and architecture. And then even has a few little, if you look down there, I don't know if you can see, there's a shoe, which is a little drawing that Paul Smith did into the sand in the foundry. So right to the last moment, this process is kind of live. And then I think there's 3 other drawings. So this project was a sort of, I suppose, a kind of more representational version of the same idea of kind of this sort of heavy metal background, which is London. And the pattern, of course, we didn't invent, happens everywhere in London, happens everywhere in the world. Interlocking circles is about the oldest pattern there is, and we see it everywhere. And I suppose the question that Seth Siegel had posed about the relationship between textiles and the making of the world, of the whole world, kept on preoccupying us through this. And this is one of his pieces of textiles. This is a Coptic tunic from the 3rd century. And actually, its kind of relationship to the decorative is so clear. I mean, the rhymings through textiles to everything else we make is everywhere. And we decided that we wanted to test that idea of the relationship between, I suppose, the territory and the textile. So we went to look for a city that was made entirely by textiles. This was at ETH, to see if we could prove his theory. And from here, we went to, we've been to Ireland and we've been to Germany. And in Germany, we went to Force. And these are some of the surveys that I talked about, where our students, our studio is about 50 students, go to a city and then they draw everything. They draw and photograph the whole city. And they all draw it in the same technique to make what we call the atlas, which is the first step of design. So in this case, sorry, it's a bit pixelated, it was a total survey of this disappearing city. Forst was the second biggest textile producer in Germany in the 19th century. It had 400 textile factories and was, in a sense, a rival to Manchester or Lyon or many of the great industrial textile cities. But now it's nearly gone. It's an absolutely extraordinary thing. So our project was really about trying to see what the future could hold for these disappearing cities. This is the central square. That's it now. A kind of urbanism in reverse, where nature somehow recolonizes where people once were. And you can see there the bridge, the bench, the girls are gone, the city's gone. Quite the most wild place I've been to in Europe. The infrastructure, the waterways, the gardens, the Schreber gardens, the allotment gardens, the bits of city that remain in the forest. Trying to record all of that and to see if there is another idea of the city that can come from it. And these are some of their projects where they were somehow making this sort of retrofitted garden city that included the one remaining textile mill, Plattenbau. This kind of, I think it's because I was English that they thought I'd like this kind of romantic landscape with a little cottage reflected out of the Plattenbau. And of course those energy landscapes which are kind of marching their way through that bit of Eastern Germany, owned by the Swedish, amazing. And then they could be repurposed as a kind of lakeside city. And of course, this is one of the few textile mills remaining with this kind of absolutely extraordinary ruination. And it brought us back to John Soane in the Bank of England. John Soane was a late 18th century, early 19th century English architect who met Piranesi during his grand tour and was absolutely fascinated by this condition of ruination, which he considered to be the most perfect architectural moment. This is when architecture is liberated from all these terrestrial things like program, people, and goes back to what it's meant to be, just kind of space. And it's a very powerful image, this one. This is from his colleague Joseph Gandy, sorry. And it's become one of the sort of most famous images of architectural history, or at least in Britain. The Bank of England was built, and of course, I don't think he really intended it to happen, but it did. It didn't become a ruin through neglect. It became a ruin because they demolished it, which is tragic. And also, I think, really interesting how few shapes we have. There's Gordon Matta Clark on the left, 200 years apart from John Soane. But, you know, as humans, we only know a few shapes. So this fascination with Soane led to this next project, this is a section through his house museum in London, that I showed an image of that space earlier on, the picture gallery. And we decided that we would try and rebuild it in Zurich, rebuild a replica. So that's the picture gallery as it is now, and that's our version of it. So we weren't able to borrow the paintings, so they've sort of shadowed them all in. But even these little acorns that were in the original one are then light bulbs. And the students rebuilt this in 2 weeks as a kind of doppelganger replica. You can see that that bit is from the first building. This bit is from the second building, which I didn't show. And of course, they had to invent their own exterior because this building has no exterior. But they built all the layers that then take Soane's world, which is really pictorial. It has no views out, it just has paintings. We put the drawings on, and then it looks out into landscape. And then that project then got turned over once again to become the stage, or the tribune, for a series of installations, exhibition installations at ETH last year. So these things are permanently somehow feeding each other. This is the ETH building just outside Zurich, and then our installation on the roof. Some of our students who built these things, they designed them, and then overlooking this kind of very strange kind of Swiss agricultural landscape with this center of technology sort of pumping out the human genome next to agriculture, which then is, I suppose, a reflection on these kind of spaces, these sort of otherworldly academic spaces. And this is another one in England, which is a project which is under construction. This is Cambridge. That's King's College Chapel, if anybody knows that, the great Gothic, late Gothic chapel. And this is Churchill College, which is just on the outskirts of Cambridge, where we're doing a new building. Again, a doppelganger, again, a copy. So this sort of the English garden, the English meadow as a setting out. And the original building was built in the 60s, early 60s, late 50s, as a series of courtyards. In fact, there's a better version of this building, which is a building by James Stirling. He entered the competition. I think he did the better one. But there you go. That's one in the architecture books. But Shepherd Robson won the competition with this courtyard plan, which is very typical of Cambridge, of Oxford and Cambridge, of all the colleges. And so we decided kind of to repeat it, but rather than leave it empty, as they normally are, to absolutely fill it with program, to fill it with a forest, with a garden. And so our project, which was a competition, is this white one. And strangely, there were 20 firms entered the competition, and we were the only ones to do a courtyard, when it seemed absolutely obvious that that was the thing to do. But maybe that's why we won, is that we did the obvious thing. This is the original courtyards, and hopefully what ours will be like soon. And then the main difference is that ours, all the bedrooms face outwards, whereas theirs face inwards and outwards. And then we have this kind of cloister. So this sort of this sort of super wide open corridor on all floors around the garden, because these guys end up looking into each other. And if you go into those courtyards, they've always got the curtains drawn. And then we also then started trying to put a bit more tension into the form, into the square form, and slightly curve it, slightly cut its elevation. So the whole thing is sort of similar to the original building, but maybe not quite as kind of as loose, a bit sharper than the 60s version, and it's all made of timber. The original is concrete and brick. Ours is made of timber, of oak. It's made of reclaimed oak from France, from railway carriages. Not, again, mainly because of its colour. Oak looks great when it's new, it's fantastic when it's old, and it's terrible in between. It goes all patchy like a kind of slightly sick dog, like black spots and stuff. So by using old timber, it was really good quality, but also really dark, which is what we were interested in a kind of... and then, when we did the competition, we were interested in the opposite of the concrete and brick, and then made it timber. But of course, concrete always was timber anyway. So maybe these differences are much closer than we think. This is some of the material samples. This is the building, sort of in its location. This image was done for the building permission by a Swedish guy in the office. And we nearly didn't get permission because he was right to put some cricket going on here, because that's what the English do. But this is a wicket keeper. There's meant to be one on the other side. And the guy from the city was like going, you just don't understand this city. There isn't a wicket keeper. And then now the building is going up at the moment. And this is a view of it. So hopefully sort of slightly melancholic feel to it. Cambridge is very, very flat. And it has this incredible the flatness brings a sort of mistiness that the weather just comes down and hovers over the ground. And I think that that's something that we're hoping will be part of the new building. The original building is quite muscular in terms of structure, and so ours is sort of then quite expressive on the inside. And as I said, concrete was always timber anyway, except when it wants to be brickwork, which is the next project, which is a studio for a photographer in London. It's a long, thin building in a very ordinary street in West London, which is being built at the moment, and is a kind of retake on the Soane building. The site has no views out, and so what we decided we were interested in was like Soane, light comes in from above, and views are only ever internal. So this is a first model of the idea of room followed by garden, followed by room, followed by garden, etc. Almost like a kind of section through a camera lens. So you have the street is there, and then building, garden, building, garden, building, and then garden. And as you go from the street to the back, it becomes more and more private, like a retreat. So that's post-production, archive, the studio itself, and then a kitchen and a library and a gym. And then it's 7 meters wide and about 70 meters long. All the light comes in from above, from these things through the structure, and then all the views internally are just pictures. This is the site. It's a really kind of crappy, light industrial residential street in West London over there. It's not that important. The site is here before the buildings were taken down. This is the client. This is the photographer. It's a German photographer called Jürgen Teller, who's a kind of art fashion photographer. Completely amazing guy who gets very close to his subjects. And just a few pictures of his. I mean, he's the first person to photograph Kate Moss. And basically entirely portraiture. This is Richard Hamilton, the British artist, Vivienne Westwood, David Hockney, which I think is a great photograph. I really like the garden. And his mother back in Germany. And his later work has been, like many people, going back to nature. Yeah, this is him. Self-portrait's also part of it. And he always shoots on location. So this is his daughter, Lola. And this is the ground that I showed earlier on. This is this bit of clay, which is so kind of typical of everything you do in London. You always end up in this sort of sticky mud. Kind of building in London is always tight. And then the demolition of the old buildings. And then we found out that the neighbors, although this wall belongs to Jürgen, and we were going to knock it down, the neighbors had grown lots of plants up here and had built sheds along the side. And so Jürgen said, well, look, we don't have to take it down, do we? We don't have to have all new wall, because that's just mean. It's just unneighborly, even though legally they weren't supposed to do that. So we kept it, and then as the project's gone on, we've kept more and more and more of what we found. And mainly to do with just walking around site, and Jürgen and me basically pointing at things and sort of saying, well, that's the first tree. And then just working up against this sort of bricky, muddy bit of London. As I said, concrete is always close to timber, and they're always in this sort of incredible kind of relationship of scale, scale of timber, scale of pouring, and this is the building going up, this very crude technique for reinforcement bar, just make a jig and bend it on site. And then all the concrete is then registered back into the brickwork. Occasionally you get these sort of spillages, this sort of gooey stuff that comes out, which I think is going to be part of the garden as well. And then you tooth it in where you need to into the existing stuff. So there I've shown the building more or less. And then you have this garden, a hard garden, a breaking garden, a kind of ruined garden, a very dense garden, and then sort of, you're back to nature there. And effectively, it's our take on this kind of ongoing section of top-lit spaces with pictures. The first floor space in the monk's parlour are there, and so these are kind of like extended gardens. So a building with no views out, but only horizons within. This is the first space, the first garden. This is it, kind of about last week. The bits of natural history, collecting water, allowing brickwork to grow, allowing asphalt to crack, and then these views through. So every room has light from the top and light from one side, from one of the gardens. So that's it kind of coming through. That's it on the left as a kind of rendering, and then on the right about a week and a half ago. Everything is structured by this ceiling, which is all poured in situ, and again goes back to this notion of construction, of kind of timber being the sort of the generator for all of this. So it's amazing the pressure that comes out of concrete in order to hold it in place. And it's all done by these guys. It's all hammers and nails. So like 96 hands at the beginning, it's just this very, very basic relationship between a bit of metal and a bit of wood that then can grow into a building, can grow into the city. And when they started on site, the first thing that these guys do, they're called formwork chippies in England. So formwork chippies are carpenters, formwork chippies are the top of the pile because they're the ones who can make everything backwards. And they start by making a box for their nails. That's the first thing they do. And that became, I suppose, the beginning of what's more or less the end of the talk, getting to the end. A series of furniture we did for a Belgian company called Maniera, who asked us to do a series of, they ask architects and artists to design furniture. And we were very interested in these kind of inventions, these involuntary inventions that are made on construction sites, they're made in the home. And of course, many of you probably know the most famous version of that, which is Enzo Mari's Autoprogettazione, and his book, which was just an instruction manual on making your own furniture at home from stuff from a hardware store. So ours is a sort of retake. It's called Dust-Free Friends, and it's the sort of Enzo Mari for the 21st century. It's Enzo Mari for, these are the instructions for the era of the lithium battery, the cordless drill, and the festool, where you can cut precisely and dust-free. Then combining that with wallpaper. Ever since we did the project in Raven Row, and we had those two apartments, the apartment where the old ladies lived, this kind of endless fascination with this idea of kind of covering your walls with paper and plants and gardens. And why do we do that? I mean, why, I suppose probably more so in England than in most places, but I think everywhere. So we made a little family of tables, screens, stools. This is a screen made of plywood and wallpaper. So it's incredibly simple. So you wallpaper the piece of plywood, make 2 cuts like that, another 3 that way, and then you realign them, and then you've got yourself a screen. It takes about an hour. And then you always have to switch one side. So sorry, these are a little fine, but this is a column, it's a step and a stool, which then can stack to make a column. And there are basically lots of different versions. There are tables, there are stools, each one of them which has basically the smallest number of cuts, so you can make them in the quickest time possible. And then we're just going to end here with this screen, which is actually in the building that I showed right at the beginning, in that courtyard, where we found all the materials, the timber, the cast iron, the clay, the brickwork, which was our studio when we started, is now our house. That roof is still doing what it does. It's still finding its way across the city. The little window has become a big window. Buildings have been knocked down. But I suppose what we've tried to do is our own little Geary house, our own little kind of remaking of a bit of city from a kind of totally ordinary found structure. And this is it, I suppose, over the last year. And it's still going, it will go on forever. It's a roof made out of American sections. The staircase is rented. And the building that was there in the very first slide is now lying on the floor. It's been relaid. It's the same brick as there. And just to end, when we were doing this work, we also found an entrance to some vaults. This is so typical of London. You think you know the ground that you're on. And we started emptying them out. They were completely bricked in, but we found this lintel across the top. And we found a series of 3 vaults in there, which are now empty. We don't know what to do with. But in them, we found, amongst all the many things we found, these 4 things. And this is a passport photograph of a guy called Claude Williams. It's signed on the back. He is one of the singers of Massive Attack. This is an oyster shell. I should have put a ruler next to it. It's about that big. Oysters were the fast food of the 19th century in London. This is a pot, probably 18th century, probably Dutch, and this is a clay pipe, which is the cigarette butt of the 19th century. And I don't know if you can read what it says there on that bottle. It says poison. There were many of these. And I have no idea how these 4 things relate to one another. But I think that trying to work out how they relate to one another is what design is about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Would you like to answer questions from the audience?
I'm happy to.
If the audience wants to.
I know a little bit more about these photographs than I'm letting on. Massive Attack had the studio before us. And we don't know what the buildings were built for in the first place. They're quite mysterious. The foundations are 16th century. The buildings above could be anywhere between 1890 and 1940. These kind of working buildings don't change very much. You know. In the vaults, which are very, very old, they were filled in the 1930s. So that we know because we found newspapers from 1936. And we think, but we don't know, that in the 30s, before the war, when they were worried about the war, there was a kind of a regulation that meant that unused vaults had to be filled in because they would potentially collapse. So they filled them all in, and then they locked in loads of bottles. Gin, London's Gordon gin. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of 19th century bottles of gin. I guess if you want to sort of work out how these things are related together, is that the 19th century is the century of empire. That is the century when gin, whose ingredients often came from the colonies, he comes from Bristol. Massive Attack comes from Bristol. Bristol is the port city on the west of England where all the ships that came from the Caribbean came into. And so there's a huge Afro-Caribbean community in Bristol and in West London, because the train that went from Bristol arrived at Paddington, which is in the west of London, so they settled there. I mean, when you were an immigrant, you didn't walk far from the boat or from the train, you needed work. So I guess that the story that brings Claude Williams into London is the same story that made this whole bit of London go, which was empire. It was trade. It's what brought, it's what brought Dutch ceramics to London. And I guess that's the story of the city, I would say, is almost always a story of the movement of people. Compared with, let's say, northern cities. I mean, the other great city which has the same is Glasgow, which is the sort of, you have London in the bottom right-hand corner, and you have Glasgow on the top left corner. Glasgow does America, and London does Europe, and then if it goes right the way round, it does other parts of the world. So I guess that's what brings these things together, really.
Could you explain a little bit more about the burn timber technique? I mean, what other qualities does it have? I mean, if you touch it, does your finger turn black, or
Yes.
Black?
If you touch it, your finger does turn black. Which is why it's generally only ever used on roofs. So roofs and very high up on buildings, because it's mechanically, like physically, it's very fragile. But it's very good for resisting rot, resisting water. It's very good for resisting insects, and it's very good for resisting fire. Which is why it was used, I suppose, before paints were very stable. And I've seen it used now a few times in kind of contemporary buildings where they do it, but then they wash it with a high-pressure water jet so you don't get dirty. But then it takes all the charcoal away. So it's a sort of, you can't really use it very often. But in that case, it was a kind of, it was a rhyme, I suppose. It was that photograph that we didn't want to let go. It was my colleague Takeshi bringing the photograph. And I suppose it was also one of those things where, it's kind of related to the previous question, I mean, all of London architecture is imported from somewhere. So the Georgian house is, you could say, more or less Palladian. It started with Inigo Jones, went to Italy, studied Palladio, and started making kind of Italianate Palladian villas that then got sort of simplified into the terraced house. The sash window, which is the London window, is basically Dutch. You know, if you look at any Flemish painting from the 17th century, and then you look at any London building from the 18th century, you can totally see where it came from. So I suppose the idea of having a kind of a Japanese technique felt as appropriate as any other London tradition which is imported. But it was sort of like a little memento. It's on the roof of the building, so you can't touch it. So That's why at the back of the building, on the street, on the alleyway, it's cast iron, because that is tough. You know, it's an alleyway where they, you know, the big bins, the big metal bins on wheels, you know, they crash them into the building, and you know, and it can sort of take it. But it is very fragile. Well, that room, yeah, we did put quite a lot of effort into it. It was a sort of, I must say, we had the most amazing client who, when we found it, he said, look, I'm not interested in historic rooms. This is a contemporary art gallery, contemporary art space. I'm no interest in any of this. And then we started showing him these photographs, and then we had, in the box of photographs, we had a receipt from the Chicago Art Institute for one room. And in the end, his curiosity was just too much. You know, we just couldn't quite leave that room alone. So we located it. Initially, they wanted to sell it back to us, or to the client, for huge amounts of money. I mean, mad amounts, hundreds of thousands. And then the client just said, you know what, keep it. I mean, it's been fun looking for it. And then, if I remember rightly, somebody else stepped in, a historian stepped in, who said, look, this is stupid. Why are you trying to make money on this? This room should go back to this building. This is where it came from. So eventually we did kind of negotiate. It was a token fee, I think like £5,000 or something for admin. And we got it back, and it went back in. And then the question about what color came up. And most of the interiors are white, or in fact they get painted over and over and over again. With that one, he painted it the same color as it was originally. So before it was stripped, they did paint analysis, and in the 18th century, most of the colors for interiors were like stony colors, both on the outside and on the inside of buildings, because all public buildings in London are made of Portland stone, which is this kind of very pale, very beautiful limestone. So cathedrals, museums, very posh houses, maybe out of Portland stone. If you were quite rich, like these guys were, you painted your wood to look like stone. So even like had veining in it to make it fake stone. And in fact, there was a whole art of painted stone. And those buildings would have been painted in those colors. And it's only in the 19th century that they start using big colors, like red interiors and things like. If you go to the National Gallery or the Royal Academy, and you get these kind of really rich interiors. That's very recent. And black, the color that we associate with London, is totally late 19th century. No, it's when Prince Albert, who was Queen Victoria's husband, died, she declared a state of national mourning. She was absolutely devastated when he died. And part of that state of national mourning was that everything had to be painted black. And she wore black for the rest of her life. And somehow a tradition was invented, but it's kind of 1890s. I mean, before that, London was every color you can imagine. But so that grey, it's actually a sort of slightly browny grey, is the original color of the room. Sorry, that wasn't the quickest answer.
No more questions? Thank you very much, Tom.
Okay, thank you.